His son was brutally murdered, and as a father, even though he stood less than 10 meters away, he couldn't do anything. Almost in an instant, fear, collapse, pain, anger, helplessness, all surged in his heart at once. However, after the perpetrator was caught, this father, who had lost his beloved son, surprisingly backed out in court when confronting the judge, actively exonerating the killer. This left everyone present stunned. What reason led him to make such a choice? Was it forgiveness? Or did he want the other person to pay blood with blood? The main character of the story is Nick, a senior executive at a listed company. He was not only successful in his career, but also had a very happy and harmonious family. A beautiful wife and 2 obedient, understanding sons. Although they weren't extremely wealthy, their life was perfectly content. On the day Nick took his son to a school ice hockey game, everything changed. The father and son were walking home, chatting cheerfully. Recalling his son's performance on the ice, Nick couldn't stop smiling. Clearly, he had high hopes for his eldest son. Halfway, Nick noticed the car's fuel tank was almost empty, so he drove into a nearby gas station to fill up. His son, Brendan, also happened to need to buy a bottle of water. But it was in these few fleeting tens of seconds that the father and son were forever separated. As Brendan stepped into the convenience store, an armed gang followed closely behind. They wore masks, carried weapons, and without a word, they subdued the store owner. This terrified Brendan. Nick saw this and intended to rush in to save him, but he was unexpectedly hit by another customer who was hastily fleeing, sending him flying. This group of people in the store didn't seem to be there to steal money, as Brendan posed no threat to them. Yet, at the instigation of his accomplices, one of the henchmen still pulled out a knife. This henchman, swift as lightning, brutally stabbed and killed innocent Brendan right in the convenience store. After the deed, they brazenly left. This was probably the fastest Nick had ever run in his life. He caught one of the henchmen who hadn't gotten into the car yet. It was the killer himself. In the struggle, Nick tore off the man's mask, clearly seeing his true face. But unfortunately, the man still escaped his grasp. Nick didn't pursue him further, but rushed into the store to save his son. By this time, Brendan's throat was injured or stabbed, bleeding profusely. Nick, in pain and helplessness, took his son to the hospital, hoping to save his life. But just a few minutes later, the doctor declared his son deceased. Not long after, the police arrested several suspects and invited Nick to identify them. He only needed a glance to distinguish the culprit, because that man's face he would never forget, even in death. But unexpectedly, the police then gave him another piece of bad news. Because the gas station where the crime occurred had no surveillance cameras, no physical evidence was left. Moreover, Nick was the only witness and the victim's father. The jury might consider Nick's testimony unreliable to accept. In that case, the perpetrator was very likely to be acquitted. Now their only option was to negotiate with the other side. For the perpetrator to voluntarily confess and be sentenced to only 3 to 5 years in prison. Because they didn't know what evidence the police had to avoid life imprisonment, he would surely agree. But this would significantly shorten the perpetrator's sentence. What was even more infuriating was that the perpetrator didn't kill for robbery, but killing was just a ritual for them to join the gang. Such a cruel act, yet only sentenced to 3 to 5 years. Nick's mood immediately plummeted to the deepest abyss. Right at the court session, Nick once again saw the man who had killed his son. The opponent quickly recognized his gaze. After their eyes met, the killer even made a gun gesture towards him. It was clear that when the judge offered a plea bargain, the perpetrator was extremely pleased. 3 to 5 years meant nothing to him. But in Nick's eyes, this was not just a provocation, but an insult. It was contempt for human life, a complete lack of remorse beyond salvation. This kind of scum basically didn't deserve to live. So when the judge asked if he would accept the plea bargain, Nick said something that astonished everyone. In front of the judge, Nick chose to withdraw from testifying. This meant the perpetrator would be set free as innocent. Nick's action shocked everyone present at the scene. In the killer's eyes, this was an absolute victory. No one could kill someone and still be acquitted. But he did it. The gang members, upon hearing the news, all came to celebrate with him. In this moment, they seemed to have become the rulers of that area. Seeing them madly celebrating their victory, Nick felt an indescribable discomfort in his heart. He silently memorized the faces of all the gang members in the car parked by the roadside. Waiting for them to drive away arrogantly, Nick stealthily followed behind. He trailed them to a residential area. It was clear that the man who had killed his son had successfully joined the gang. As a reward, the boss even gave him a girl, then drove away with his brothers. After witnessing that scene, Nick suddenly realized something. He quickly returned home, preparing to go to the basement to get a suitable weapon. At this time, the perpetrator was happily with the girl, while the boss and his accomplices were all absent. That was the best opportunity to act. Yes, Nick wanted to personally avenge his son, but searching again and again, he couldn't find any weapon to his liking. And just then, his youngest son walked in. Nick didn't want his actions to implicate his family, so when his son asked what he was doing, he gave a random excuse to evade. Finally, he found a dagger in a junk box. It could be carried on him and was hard to detect. Then he drove back to the residential area from earlier. It wasn't hard to see that Nick's mood at this moment was quite complex. After all, he was a law-abiding, decent citizen. Crossing that boundary was not easy. Just as he was hesitating whether to give up, the perpetrator actively walked out of the house. Seeing him living so carefree, Nick was reminded of his son. He had to do something. Unfortunately, the girl who was intimately with the perpetrator suddenly came out. Seeing Nick sneaking around, she seemed a little suspicious. Nick ignored her and walked straight towards the perpetrator. In the pitch-black night, a figure suddenly appeared, startling the perpetrator. Nick had never fought before. The only thing he had was the will to kill the other person. However, after a long struggle, he couldn't do anything to the opponent, even dropping the dagger he carried. This gave the perpetrator an opportunity. He quickly stood up, picked up the knife and snatched it. Nick instinctively lunged to stop him, and the two wrestled on the ground again. In the struggle, the knife stabbed the perpetrator, which surprised Nick a little. He had wanted the perpetrator to die countless times, but when he actually committed murder, he was completely terrified. In a panic, he pulled the knife out of the opponent's body, and the fresh red blood soaking out made his heart tremble. It was clear that he had avenged his son, but he fled like a loser. He drove to a deserted suburb, and although a few tens of minutes had passed, he was still so panicked that he couldn't calm down. After wiping his fingerprints off the knife, Nick got out of the car and threw the knife into a small river. Then he sped away. Back home, his wife and youngest son were tidying up. Although he tried to act normal, his wife still noticed something unusual. He hastily made an excuse that he had just slipped and there was nothing to worry about. He kept the fact that he had just avenged his son absolutely secret. He wanted this incident to pass quickly so that the whole family could start a new life. The next day at work, colleagues noticed that Nick seemed unusually relaxed, completely unlike someone who had just lost a child. They still didn't know that Nick had killed someone last night and avenged his son. Just then, female detective Jessica came to the company to give him good news. The killer of his son had been killed last night. Nick skillfully steered the conversation in another direction, blaming the killer's death on a gang dispute. However, Detective Jessica had her own thoughts. She noticed Nick's hand was wrapped in a bandage. Clearly, Nick was the biggest suspect. Even so, Jessica didn't say much, seemingly tacitly accepting Nick's actions. But soon enough, this matter reached the ears of the gang boss. Doe was not just an ordinary gang member, but his biological younger brother. Nick was in big trouble. That evening, the bald-headed boss summoned all gang members to discuss how to avenge his younger brother. At first, they thought another gang was responsible, and they were all a little hesitant to fight. Because once a confrontation occurred, no one could be sure who would live and who would die. Until a member mentioned that someone saw a man in a suit lingering near the residential area the night before the incident. The bald-headed boss immediately thought of one person. Because gang members wouldn't wear suits, the killer absolutely couldn't be from the Tonlin or Two High gangs. With that, the bald-headed boss picked up a newspaper from a nearby table, which reported the murder of the son of an insurance company executive. The boss sent someone to show the newspaper to the witness, and sure enough, the person immediately recognized Nick. An ordinary person, nothing special. Dealing with him would be too easy. Moreover, Nick's company name was already in the newspaper. No further investigation was needed. Very quickly, the bald-headed boss sent people to track Nick, preparing to find an opportunity to kill him. A dark-skinned thug from behind pulled out a pistol, quickly moved forward, preparing to finish Nick off at close range. Fortunately, Nick had sensed it early, so when the opponent got close, Nick managed to overpower one of them with difficulty. But he then realized that the other side of the street was full of people who wanted his life. Nick realized that this was an act of revenge aimed at him. He used the chaos to hide in a nearby alley. But immediately after, a group of gang members also aggressively chased after him. Fortunately, Nick was quite familiar with the area. He just needed to run past the building ahead to find where his car was parked. This was a true race against death. Even a second's delay could mean being caught by the opponent. At that point, he would surely die a terrible death. So they both desperately ran forward while relentlessly pursuing each other. At some point, Nick was almost caught, but the desire to live kept him running. A moment later, he ran into a commercial building. To prevent the opponents from chasing him, Nick locked each door he passed to buy himself more time. By the time the gang members broke open the doors, Nick had passed through the kitchen lobby and successfully reached the parking lot. Nick deliberately honked his car alarm so the gang members couldn't distinguish his direction. Nick was exhausted at this point, looking for his car to seize the opportunity to escape. The gang's henchmen were also very cunning. They went directly to the rooftop to block Nick's path. At this point, for Nick to successfully escape, he had to deal with this henchman. He secretly observed in the dark, circling behind the henchman. Then he took out his car keys. Taking advantage of the henchman being distracted by the sound of the car keys, Nick decisively launched a sneak attack. Only this way could he succeed. Nick first knocked the opponent's gun away, then launched a series of powerful punches. After gaining the upper hand, he quickly scrambled up and rushed into his car. Because he had hidden a weapon in the car, the battleground for the two then moved from outside the car to inside. Neither had weapons. This was a true life and death struggle. Nick was choked. He grabbed the gear stick and shifted the car to neutral, causing the entire car to immediately slide down the slope. Nick then opened the windshield, creating space for himself to fight back and successfully pinned the henchman down. Through the rearview mirror, he saw that the car had reached the edge of the parking lot. After subduing the henchman with the seatbelt, he quickly crawled out of the car. The bald-headed boss saw the car fall from the top floor, so Nick must be up there. Taking advantage of the boss not having time to catch up, Nick quickly got into his car and sped away. By the time the opponent spotted his car, Nick had left the scene without looking back. At the same time, police sirens blared from all directions. The bald-headed boss had to give up in frustration. At this moment, Nick felt like he had just escaped death. He drove several kilometers away, terrified that the bald-headed boss would pursue him. This feeling of being close to death made him understand what true fear was. But he didn't know that the briefcase he had dropped while fleeing was now in the bald-headed boss's hands. Inside were pictures of his wife and children. After failing to pursue Nick, the bald-headed boss decided to shift his focus to Nick's family. Early the next morning, a henchman carried a package to the insurance company building. As he entered, he loudly shouted Nick's name. This man's attitude was extremely arrogant, yelling loudly in the office. After throwing the package at Nick, he also personally threatened him. Finally, he was collectively escorted out of the office by 3 security guards. Those around were surprised by this man's sudden appearance. Only Nick understood in his heart. This was surely related to yesterday's chase. He opened the package and found that it was his own briefcase. Everything in the briefcase was intact, except for a red line drawn across the picture of his wife and children. On the back of the photo was a phone number, clearly written by the bald-headed boss. In a frenzy, Nick saw it and called the number. The two of them were originally strangers who had never met, but unexpectedly became enemies due to coincidences. After realizing his family might be in danger, Nick grew more and more afraid. Because yesterday's chase had proven that they dared to do anything. He quickly called the police, telling them that his family's lives were being threatened and requesting police assistance. Then, he quickly drove home, trying to get there before the bald-headed boss. After seeing his wife and son were safe and sound, the first thing Nick thought of was to check the doors and windows of the house, preventing the opponents from storming in and waiting for the police to come to their rescue. Fortunately, not long after he got home, female detective Jessica arrived with her team. Nick finally breathed a sigh of relief. The first thing Jessica said when they met was to question him. Was the death of the gang member earlier related to him? Nick didn't want to admit the truth that he had killed someone. So when Jessica asked, he didn't know how to answer. Although he had police protection, every nerve in Nick's body was still taut like a violin string, not daring to let his guard down for a moment. Time passed minute by minute. The clock struck 2 a.m. Nick was so tired he was almost falling asleep. A car horn woke him up. He looked out, in the direction of the sound, and discovered a terrifying scene. The 2 police officers guarding outside had been killed. Nick immediately panicked, but he didn't know that the bald-headed boss had already led his men to break into his house at this moment. Being able to escape an attack by 3 gunmen was a rare stroke of luck, but the opponents were now holding Nick's wife and son hostage, leaving Nick completely under their control. Faced with such brutal people, an ordinary person could only resign themselves to fate. Nick didn't care about his own death. He only hoped his wife and son would be safe and sound. But the bald-headed boss didn't give him a choice, just as he had said on the phone. Life or death was his decision. After 3 gunshots, Nick's entire family lay on the floor. All grievances seemed to vanish in the moment Nick collapsed. But did you think the story ended here? No, absolutely not. After receiving emergency treatment, Nick survived. The bullet did not hit any vital organs. Waking up, Nick immediately thought of his family. But the doctor told him that his wife had died from severe wounds. His youngest son was currently in a coma, his condition uncertain. This outcome was unacceptable to Nick. He would rather it had been himself who died. He went to his son's bedside, recounting many memories between father and son, about the happy life of their family of four before. Nick had now fallen from heaven to hell. Life no longer has any meaning was the truest description of him at this moment. After recovering and being discharged from the hospital, Nick withdrew a large sum of money and found someone to investigate the address of that phone number. He went to an underground arms dealer and threw a bag of cash at the man. He wanted to buy the best weapons available. Seeing him as a big spender, the owner didn't hesitate and immediately opened his small arsenal. 3 pistols had different powers, but Nick wasn't satisfied. He also chose a more powerful double-barreled shotgun from the dealer. This way, whether close or far, he could ensure firepower. Nick paid the arms dealer $5,000 for all 4 guns. Back home, he began to study and practice day and night, preparing for the upcoming revenge. After finishing his preparations, he took his guns out of the house and drove